Peace, I'm back. And welcome to what I call Rational Lens Podcast. You understand? This is Rational Lens Podcast. I'm your host, Zahudi Atmos Minkafare, also go by the name of Rock Barzini. This is my podcast where I'm breaking down information, trying to give you the real truth. You understand? This real truth and trying to bring focus of logic and reasoning. So that's why I call this podcast Rational Lens Podcast, where logic and truth come into focus. Your third eye being your lens. Because if your lens is not focused, then you can't see things clearly. And that's what I'm here to do. Your cousin, what's good? And so this one is called George Washington and his Moorish ancestry and the rewriting of the Constitution. Because a lot of people don't know that George Washington was black too. So Obama wasn't the first black president. And before George Washington, we had 16 other black presidents. You understand? And George Washington and the founding fathers were also dark-skinned black or mulatto. You understand? Before your Europeans assimilated themselves in. You understand? This was all being ran by black people. You understand? So this is part 2. You understand? So I left off, I was talking about the 5 civilized tribes. Your Choctaw, your Chickasaw, your Cherokee, your Muskogee, and your Seminoles. And we talked about your Iroquois. And I was talking about how your elite Moors, yeah, they got a book out. He was dark-skinned mulatto. Yeah. But exactly in the book that you're talking about, it's another book. That's in the book you talking about. I forgot the name of it, but one book that I read, they said he was straight dark-skinned. So either or, he was black, because we know that mulatto people are black. You understand? And so George Washington was black, and I'm going to tell you about his ancestor, the Moorish Nicholas Martial. He was a Moor, he was a Huguenot, and he came from France, and he was related to George Washington. So George Washington had black blood inside of him. You understand? But let's get through this first. We was talking about the 5 civilized tribes. We was talking about the Trail of Tears. And the reason why we were talking about the Trail of Tears, because when the elite Moors came from Europe, they pushed the indigenous Aboriginal Native Americans west to Mississippi. And so this is what happened during the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. You understand? So I was reading about the Trail of Tears when we left off from the first lecture. It says the Trail of Tears was a forced displacement of about 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850, and an additional 1,000 of Native Americans and their black slaves. And I told you that part is a sabotage of the truth, because they be sabotaging the truth in these Wikipedias and in some of these books when they telling the story. We were never slaves. The Native Americans were never slaves. They were all black, melanated, big nose, big lips, high cheekbones, prototype. And we never were slaves. And chattel slavery wasn't in effect then. Chattel slavery is what was created by the Caucasians, who assimilated themselves into the situation and wrote themselves into history. You understand? The original Native Americans were dark-skinned. And when we talk about slavery, it wasn't chattel slavery. Yeah, they went to war, like I said. Yeah, there probably was war with certain things and people took people hostage, but they never degraded the humanity of a person. You still was allowed to read, write, know math, science, medicine, be educated, and all these things. You know what I'm saying? And the only thing was you had to incorporate yourself or assimilate yourself into the tribe that took you hostage. So the only thing you did if you was Cherokee and you went to war with a Seminole, just say by example, they didn't put you in chains, they didn't whip you, they didn't lynch you, they didn't do things like that to you. The only thing they said, now you take on our culture, our traditions, our culture. That's the only thing. You were still allowed to have a living and be a man or be a human. You understand? So chattel slavery didn't exist. So when they talk about their black slaves, we got to dodge the sabotage. That's another way of Europeans sabotaging the truth. But that's why I'm here doing this, because we got to use our logic and reasoning and deal with the facts to break these type of sabotage tactics of the truth. It says, within that were ethnically cleansing by the United States government. And when they talk about the United States government, they're talking about your elite Moors. Your elite Moors set up the United States Corporation that was incorporated in 1871, where George Washington became the president. I told you, there were 16 other presidents before George Washington, and George Washington himself was black. He was a mulatto black. You understand? And he had black ancestral, and I'm going to tell you about Nicholas Martial. He was a black Moor that came from France. He was a Huguenot. And remember, George Washington come from the Huguenots. And we're going to talk about who the Huguenots were. You understand? They were another black group of people who were chased out of during the Inquisition of Spain. And they went to France. And they hid themselves or incorporated themselves into Protestant religion, like Lutheran, Methodist, Anabaptist, Seventh-day Adventist, Calvinism, so forth. You understand? They had to hide themselves or incorporate themselves into these Protestant religions so that they wouldn't get killed. So when we talk about the Huguenots, or when we talk about those black Moors that came from Spain and Portugal, who were chased out of Spain and Portugal, they were Jews and they were Muslims. And they went to France, South France, and they incorporated themselves, or should I say, assimilated themselves into Protestantism. And you got different aspects of Protestantism, right? But let me finish reading this Trail of Tears, right? It says, as part of the Indian Removal Act. So when we talk about the Indian Removal Act, this is what we're talking about when your elite Moors came over here and they pushed the indigenous Aboriginal Native Americans, your Cherokee, your Choctaw, your Chickasaw, your Muskogee, and your Seminoles. You understand? They took land and resource from them and they pushed them west of the Mississippi. And this is where you had something called the Trail of Tears. Because during the Trail of Tears, a lot of your Aboriginal indigenous Native Americans fought for their land and resource. They didn't want to give up their land and resource to these elite Moors. So that started the war between your elite Moors that came from Europe, who were under Britain, who got their independence with help of your Native Americans. And then later on, another war took place with your elite Moors and your Aboriginal Native Americans, which we'll call the Indian War. You understand? But this was all under the Indian Removal Act, right? The Indian Removal Act was the United States government. When they say the United States government, they're talking about your elite Moors who came and incorporated in 1871 the United States, and George Washington rewrote the Constitution, which turned it into the United States Constitution of America. And they had it in all capital letters. And we know the capital letters mean corporation. You understand? George Washington was the one that did this. But you had the Indian War and you had the Indian Removal Act, where the United States government policy of ethnic cleansing through the forced displacement of self-governing tribes of American Indians. They tell you right here, it says, self-governing tribes of American Indians. So before your elite Moors came over here from Europe and conquered and robbed and stole land and resource and enslaved these Native Americans, they already were self-governing themselves. They already had a constitution. They already had a government. They already had an economic system. They already had a military. They already had treaties amongst each other. You understand? So right here, the Indian Removal Act says, the Indian Removal Act was the United States government policy of ethnic cleansing through the forced displacement of self-governing tribes, more than one, tribes of American Indians from their ancestral homeland in the eastern United States to the lands west of the Mississippi River. From the eastern United States, it's the East Coast, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, you understand, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, that's all the South, you understand? And they came up north. So we're in the east, the eastern United States, and they were pushed to the Mississippi River. Remember, the Mississippi River is the Nile River here in the United States. The Mississippi River was first. You gotta understand, these lands over here that we call the America, they were the first lands to come from out of the waters. A lot of people don't know that. That's why we're the oldest people over here. The first lands to come out of the waters and peek up out of the waters were your North, South America, you understand, Asia. They were your first to come from out of the waters. We're the oldest people over here. We are the Cherokee. We are the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Seminoles, Iroquois, Cayuga, Seneca, Tuscarora. It's so many tribes, I can't even name all of them, but y'all get what I'm saying. We are those people. Atlantis, Lemuria was over here. Before there was any Africa or Europe, Lemuria and Atlantis was over here. You understand? So when we talk about the Indian Removal Act, was the United States government policy of ethnic cleansing through the forced displacement of self-governing tribes of American Indians from their ancestral homeland in the eastern United States to the land west of the Mississippi River, specifically to a designated Indian territory, roughly present-day Omaha, which many scholars had labeled a genocide. The Indian Removal Act in 1830, the key law which authorized the removal of Native Americans, was signed into law by the United States President Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was black. You have to understand, this is black warring against black people. White people wasn't in the, didn't come into the play yet. They were still slaves. They were still slaves under the Moors. We had them under slavery. You understand? And there's a good book out called White Slavery. Get the book. Look it up on the internet. It's a book called White Slavery. Yeah, I said not Omaha, but Oklahoma. But you know we had Native Americans in Omaha, right? When they was pushed from the west into the west of Mississippi, then they started putting them on reservation camps, which was nothing but prison camps, or what they call detention camps. And they put them on these reservations. That's why they're on reservations now. And the people that you see on these reservations are not the original Native Americans. You understand? But it was Andrew Jackson that brought in the Indian Removal Act. And Andrew Jackson was black. You can look this up. He was a black man. This white interpretation that they show of Andrew Jackson is not the truth. You understand? So Andrew Jackson was a black man. It says on May 28, 1830, although Andrew Jackson took a hard line on Indian removal, the law was primarily enforced during Martin Van Buren administration in 1837 to 1841. After the enactment of the act, approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, including thousands of their black slaves. Remember, dodge the sabotage. They weren't slaves. They were Native Americans. You understand? So these are all black people. No slaves. This was a black on black war that was going on. And your elite Moors that were under the Britain, they were the ones that were pushing the conflict and taking over the land and resource of the Native Americans. Now, what happened with the elite Moors and the British Crown, it was taxation. Which I don't understand is, in Europe, the elite Moors could not be taxed. You understand? The elite Moors could not be taxed. So when they was in this business deal with the British Crown and they came over here and settled and, took land and resource and settled things with the Native Americans that were here, then the British Crown started taxing them for their product that they was trading back and forth. You understand? And those elite Moors wasn't going for it because they knew as an Englishman, they couldn't be taxed. So your English people were dark-skinned people. And let me read something. And this is real important. It says the statement that the Englishmen could not be taxed, right? In England, all men were subject to various taxes through history. Through the right to be taxed only with consent was a central issue during the American Revolution. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," applied to the American colonists who argued they should not be taxed by the British Parliament because they had no elect representation in it. Y'all hear that? So they didn't think they should be taxed. They knew they wasn't supposed to be taxed because a lot of these Moors that came over here were elite Moors. They came from the royal crown. So they knew that they couldn't be taxed. The only ones that could be taxed was the colonists. You understand? So those colonists would be your Native Americans, your Aboriginal Native Americans. They were the ones that could be taxed according to the British Crown. But the British Crown was trying to get greedy and they were trying to tax not just the Native Americans who were known as the colonists who've been colonized by the British Crown and these elite Moors, right? But the British Crown also was trying to tax the conquistadors or the navigators that they sent over here who came over here on the strength of them under their jurisdiction and power. And so these elite Moors knew that y'all can't tax us. We're on the same level as y'all. Y'all can tax these people that we're robbing and stealing from, but y'all can't tax us, right? So I'm going to read that again. It says, in England, all men were subjected to various taxes throughout history, though the right to be taxed only with consent was a central issue during the American Revolution. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," applied to the American colonists who argued they should not be taxed by the British Parliament because they had no elected representation in it. Right? It says, number one, colonial American perspective. The colonists argued that their rights as Englishmen mean they could not be taxed without their consent. In other words, we're Englishmen. We're from the high society. We're a part of the royal crown, of that throne. We're your peers. Y'all can't tax us. We're Englishmen. The right is, they called it the right as an Englishman. And because they were upper echelon elite Moors coming from the royal bloodline, meaning that they looked at themselves as being gods. They were gods in the flesh. You understand? So they were above taxation. This is what they were saying, because when you talk about the royal crown and the throne and the bloodline, they believed that they came from divine right. This was their divine right to rule and control the world, because they believed that their bloodline was divine, had God in it. So all this trying to tax them, they looking at them like, y'all can't tax us. We're y'all peers. We're elite Moors just like y'all. We came over here on the strength of y'all to take land and resource and enslave these people, but now y'all trying to pull the okie doke on us. And so this is what the American Revolution was about. And what happened was these elite Moors befriended the 5 civilized tribes, and they got together and they went against the British Crown, and they got their independence, 1776, right? July 4th, 1776, that's when they got their independence. So, number 1, it says the colonial American perspective. Colonists argued that their right as Englishmen, and we ain't talking about white people, we talking about black Englishmen. Your Scots, your Irish people, your Welsh, they were black people. It says the right as Englishmen meant they could not be taxed without their consent. So you can't tax us unless we want y'all to tax, unless we say y'all can tax us. You understand? Yeah, that's where you get Anglo-Saxon. You understand? But these were dark-skinned people. You understand? Speaking English. Your original English, Anglo-Saxon were dark-skinned. What you say, cuz? That's why. People take the land. Fact. That's fact, Chris. So number 2, it says the British perspective. The British government argued for the concept of virtual representation. Virtual representation. That don't even make no sense. This is how you know they've been robbing and stealing from us. They had game to rob and steal from us from the beginning. And this is our own people. So when we talk about black people, all dark-skinned folks ain't kin folks. Because they even had game on their own people of how to rob and steal from them. You understand that? Virtual representation. What? That don't even make no sense. Virtual representation? Just, that means that ain't nobody there. Virtual don't mean real. Virtual is a hologram. Right? There's nobody there to represent us, so y'all can't tax us. And on top of that, we're on the same level as y'all. We elite just like y'all. And only way y'all can do that unless we allow that. We're sovereign. We're kings. We're queens. We come from that bloodline. Y'all can't just put us in some type of economic trick bag like that. Right? So the British perspective, the British government argued for the concept of virtual representation, suggests that members of parliament, right? Members of parliament represented the interests of all British subjects, including colonists. Number 3, historical content. The principle of consent for taxation without representation date back to the Magna Carta in 1215. The Magna Carta was when they wrote the declaration, the barons who owned land against the king. And they wasn't going for this taxation. You understand? This was what they call feudalism. Feudalism was about land and taking land and taxing people on the land. This is why you got something called the landlord or tenant. These terminologies come from out of feudalism. You understand? So when they were taking the land and enslaving the people on the land, you understand? The king was taxing them. the poor people. You understand? So what happened? So feudalism in medieval Europe started. That's where it started at. What happened was the king, queen, duke, earl, esquire, barons. If you had this type of name and title, that means that you were part of the peerage group of the royal crown. That means that you were connected with the divine bloodline and you owned it land. All of them owned land. What they called that land was called allodial land. Yeah, eventually the invention of Jewish people, right? We can get into that. But that allodial land was under the royal crown. And the people, the poor people that was on that land, they had to pay taxes. And they had to give if you was a duke, a baron, a knight, an esquire, a king, they was paid homage. These people had to give them money for being on their land. So if you was a farmer, everything that you made, you had to pay a knight, a baron, a duke, a earl, a king, so forth. You had to break them off. This is where feudalism came from. And then later on, feudalism turned into a whole big land grab that they tried to do. You understand? And the people that was on that land, they were called serfs. Serfs was another way of saying slave back in medieval Europe. And these Europeans were dark-skinned people, right? And this is 1215, the Magna Carta. You understand? That's why we got to go back to Jay-Z, his album, Magna Carta. He's trying to tell us something. You understand? This is what he was trying to drop. This is what the Magna Carta was about. So in 1512, all of Europe was black kings, queens, dukes, earls, counts. You understand? They were running the show in England. In Europe, I should say too. It says, number 2, during the 18th century, the colonists were angry because they felt they were being taxed by a government where they had no voice, right? Number 3, historically, Englishmen who did not vote were still taxed, which was a point used to counter the colonial argument. Property, less men, those under 21. You understand? So this is, when we talk about Englishmen, they knew that they, as the right of an Englishman, they knew they couldn't be taxed as elite Moors unless they gave them consent, right? So this is what that was about. And this is why the American Revolution took off. You understand? And this was the reason why they got together with the Native Americans, your Moors, your elite Moors, and your indigenous Native Americans, your Chickasaw, your Cherokee, your Choctaw, your Seminole, and your Muskogee got together and they helped these elite Moors get their independence in 1776 from Britain. But they didn't know that these people that they helped was going to stab them in the back. You understand? So when we read in history that it was the white man, yeah, the white man came later on. But before the white man got in the situation, there was blacks enslaving blacks, robbing from blacks, killing blacks. This what was going on. We were the kings and queens of the planet, and we had that big ego as gods of the planet. And we walked around like we should be ruling and controlling all this. And certain people was beneath us. This was the mentality that we had. This is the mentality that they don't want us to get back into, because they know once we start thinking like as gods again, they know what's going to happen. They're going to go back into slavery like we had them. Right? So let me go back to what I was reading. We was talking about the Indian. We talked about the Indian Removal Act, right? Andrew Jackson in 1830, May 28th, took a hard line on Indian removal. The law was primarily enforced by Martin Van Buren. And all of us that come from Brooklyn, well, we got a street named after this guy, Van Buren. Van Buren Avenue. Van Buren Place. This is the guy, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, we can stop slavery now, but a lot of people don't want to stop slavery. And a lot of people want to be enslaved. This is a mind program. You know what I'm saying? So definitely we can stop it. Where we go? All right. It says in 1837 to 1841, after the enactment of the act, approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, including thousands of their slaves, were forcibly removed from their ancestral homeland, with thousands of dying during the Trail of Tears. So when we talk about the Trail of Tears, this is what happened during the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act, and these Native Americans were pushed west to the Mississippi. So all of us that got people that come from down south, this is what was going, this is what, you know, they were the people. You understand? So you had the Indian Removal Act, part of Native American genocide in the United States. The routes of the Southern removal, location the United States, the date 1830 to 1847, targeting the Native Americans in the eastern United States, attack type, death march, population transfer, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. There was 8,000 plus Native Americans killed. The perpetrators were your United States federal government, the United States Army, the state militia. So when we talk about the United States federal government, we're talking about the elite Moors and the incorporate United States Constitution that was rewritten by George Washington. Get to the point in Britain where the Moors were splitting power with the whites during the time. Well, you got to understand, all right, cuzzo, the Caucasians assimilated themselves into the situation. You understand? So from 1215 all the way into the 1500s, you had nothing but the Moors, the elite Moors that was running things in Europe. They ran Europe for 700 years. You understand? And then what happened was you had the barbarians, your German barbarians or your Indo-Germans or your Indo-Aryans who came from Central Asia. They weren't from Europe. They came from Asia. And they were fighting and warring amongst each other. They were in their barbaric state during the Iron Age. You understand? We have to go back during the Iron Age once they started to learn how to shape metal and make helmets and make chest plates and shields and stuff like that. That, you know, that was all a part of their war campaign. You understand? That they used to control and dominate. So in Central Asia, you had Attila the Hun. Look up Attila the Hun. The Huns was warring with your German tribes. They were warring and fighting with each other. And the Attila the Hun chased the Indo-Aryans or your Indo-Germans or your Indo-Europeans. You have your Europeans who were your elite Moors, right? And you had your Indo-Aryans who came from Asia, Central Asia. And what happened was those Germans or Indo-Europeans, they were chased into Europe. You understand? And some of them was chased into India, Southeast India. You understand? This is why they call Indo-Europeans, because they spread it into Europe and into Asia, India and stuff of that nature. And what happened was you had something called the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was controlled by all black people. Palestine, Julius Caesar, these guys were either dark-skinned Moors or they were mulattoes. What happened was your Indo-Europeans or your Indo-Aryans, they invaded the Roman Empire and they took down the Euro Empire. This was how the Roman Empire fell. The Roman Empire fell due to the bombardment of your barbarian invasion. You understand? And once they took over, they took on being the Romans. They took on the traditions and the customs. You understand? And that's how you got your whites assimilated into with the Moors. And then later on, those same Moors who mixed in with your whites, who started to produce your mulatto people, right? They started what they call manifest destiny, right? Manifest destiny in the discovery age. Yeah, you have, Voltron, you have mulatto Moors. They were called the Hauritans. You had the Bendanes and you had the Hauritans. They were your black Moors and you had your mulatto Moors because from the mixing in. You understand? And so all of this going on, they came over here and they were the ones that robbed and steal from the Native Americans. So that's how that that's how that happened. Yeah, but Voltron, yeah, you have mulatto Moors. Yeah, matter of fact, let me tell you their names. It's crazy. I don't want to get too far off the subject, but that's a good question. You know what I'm saying? So check it out. It says the Bandane Moors refer to the Bandane people of Mauritania. Remember, Mauritania is in Africa, right? West Africa. It says the Bandane Moors refer to the people of Mauritania, also called white Moors. It's right here. White Moors, who are a group of light-skinned people of Arab and Berber descent. They are distinguished from the darker-skinned Hauritан Moors, or black Moors, and form the two upper classes of Moorish society. The term Moor itself is a broad historical term used by Europeans for North Africans who conquered part of Iberia. So you hear that? You hear that, Voltron? They were called the Bendanes. They were your white Moors, but they were mulatto. And then you had your darker skinned Moors. So in the Moorish society, the upper echelon was all black. And then under them, you had the mulatto Moors. Yeah, the white Moors, the Shriner Moors. Yeah, the Shriners and all that. That's where all that come into play. You understand? But they were Moors. So when I talk about the founding fathers, like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Quincy Adams, these guys some of them were mulatto. You understand? Some of them was black. You understand? So, yes, they were called the Bedanes. And the darker Moors were called the Hauritans. They were your blacker Moors, and they were formed the two upper classes of Moorish society. Moorish itself is a broad historical term used by Europeans for North Africans who conquered part of the Iberia. What is Iberia? Spain and Portugal. And this is where you had the Spanish Inquisition. So a lot of your Spanish people are Moors. And a lot of your Spanish, that's why you had the Spanish people that got the light skin. They were Moors too. They were mulatto. You understand? So that was good. I'm glad you brought that question up. You understand? So when we're talking about the Indian Removal Act, that's what the Indian Removal Act was. Your elite Moors fighting against your Aboriginal indigenous after they helped them get their independence from the crown of Britain. You understand? And Andrew Jackson, he was one of those white Moors. He was a white Moor, a mulatto, you know? And how the white Moor thing happened, remember, the word slave comes from the word Slav. The Slavics or the Slovakians. The Moors was conquering these white Slavians or your Slovakians and putting them into slavery. You understand? You see them in those old movies where you see those white people rowing the boat and the guy got the whip and he's fucking whipping them. And you like, how did white people, that was their form of slavery. But they ain't showing you that it was black people who was cracking the whip on them, making them move the ship. You understand? While they was in the bottom of the ship looking dirty and malnutrition and things of that nature, those black Moors was cracking the whip on them, helping them move the ship, helping them navigate through the waters. You understand? So before there was black slavery, blacks had the whites in slavery. And what they used to do was they used to sell them to the Moorish kings. And they were Islamic. These Moors were Islamic. So they had many wives. They had harems of wives. They had temples with harems, bathhouses, and beautiful women. And then what happened was the Moors were selling them to the Islamic leaders. And they were taking their women and they were integrating them into their harems. And they were having babies by them. So that's where the Moorish, the Bedains, the white Moors came from. And then eventually these white Moors took over the royal court. They kicked them out and they took over the royal court. You understand? It became more from black to being mulatto. And then next thing you know, pale skin. You understand? But it all happened because they were sleeping with their women. They had harems and temples of beautiful women, black, white, all together. They were sleeping with them, having babies by them. And a lot of their children were being put in the position on the throne. So this is how that happened. So the Indian Removal Act, I hope you understand that. The Cherokee, the Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Trail of Tears. So let's go back to talking about the Cherokee Nation, right? So Cherokee history, I read the land that they control: West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. And they were called nations. You understand? So they were nations before the white man came over here. And regularly elected by chiefs from Cherokee towns within the nation domain. So we had chiefs. And this is what happened. What else? Treaties. All right, I'm going to read this little bit. It says the successive treaties, they had treaties with these people. You can go online and read the treaties. There's a good website, UNA Republic. They got the treaties where our ancestors wrote treaties with these elite Moors. And they tell you that the land supposed to stay in the family according to their ancestors. Go read those treaties. It's a whole bunch of them. And it'll blow your mind of the actual conversation that our ancestors was having about the land and the resource. You understand? With these elite Moors. And so the successive treaties with the British Crown and the United States reduced the Cherokee Nation original territory until by 1817, the remaining Cherokee land covered an area consisted of southwestern North Carolina, southeastern Tennessee, northeastern Alabama, and northern Georgia. Pressure to relinquish even more land within the nation, diminished territories were unrelenting. In 1817, enticed by agents of the United States, some residents of Cherokee towns in what is now far north and western South Carolina and northern Georgia abandoned what remained of the Cherokee homeland, voluntarily opts to migrate west of the Mississippi. These Cherokee migrated first to lands located in what's now Arkansas, and then in 1828 further west to the reservations established by treaties for the Cherokee Nation in what today is eastern Oklahoma. So y'all get it? This is what, and they didn't just do this to the Cherokee, they did it to the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Seminolan. This is where the Indian War came about. You understand? Let's read about Indian War. Because there was a big war. You understand? where all those Native American tribes got together and they fought against the United States Corporation. And they was tearing their butt up. They won a lot of victories. But they don't tell you that in history. They act like the white man just came over here and conquered them. Yeah, because they still in Oklahoma and they still in Omaha, Nebraska. So that's cool. So the American Indian War, right? We know it as the American Indian War. The American Indian Wars, meaning there was more than one war. The American Indian Wars, also known as the American Frontier War and the Indian Wars, was a conflict initially fought by European colonial empires, right? Your European colonial empires, which was Spain, Portugal, right? The Dutch, Germany, Russia, what else? England. These were your European colonial empires. But these European colonial empires started off, they were elite Moors before the white man assimilated himself into the bloodline. You understand? So it says, was a conflict initially fought by European colonial empires, the United States, and briefly the Confederate States of America. You understand? The Confederate States of America. And we're going, once we start talking about George Washington and the Huguenots, then y'all going to understand who really ran the Confederate states. The Confederate States was ran by black people. All those plantations, they were rich, aristocratic black people. You understand? So y'all have to understand this. Yeah, white people were in the South. Yeah, they was in the South. But you had aristocratic blacks who owned most of the land in the South. And we're going to talk about that. Right? It says the Confederate States of America and the Republic Texas against various American Indian tribes in North America. These conflicts occurred for the time of the earliest colonial settlements in the 17th century until the end of the 19th century. The various wars resulted from a wide variety of factors, the most common being the desire of settlers and governments for Indian tribe land, or I should say lands. So they still believed in feudalism. They still believed in land, taking over land, right? It says the European powers and their colonies enlisted allies, Indian tribes, to help them conduct war against each other. The colonial settlement. After the American Revolution, many conflicts were located to Pacific states or regions and frequently involved disputes over land use. Some entail cycles of violence and reprise. So don't get it twisted. A lot of when the Europeans, these black elite Moors came in, they caused a lot of confusion amongst the Native Americans and caused them to fight amongst each other because they started taking sides. Because during the American Revolution, once the elite Moors got their independence, remember I told you that they were helped by your indigenous Aboriginal tribes. You understand? And so, once they got their independence, then that's when the conflict started with them. But there was a division. These elite Moors caused the division amongst your Native Americans. You understand? And so you had certain Cherokees that helped the English, certain Native Americans that helped the French. You know what I'm saying? And they were causing divide and conquer amongst each other until the Indian War. And then these tribes started to come back together and realize what was the problem and who was causing the divide and conquer amongst them. And then you had the Indian War. You understand? Fact. So that was the Indian Wars, right? So I want to take one more. I hope y'all come back. So I'm going to click off and I'm going to come back again. because I want to keep this 30 minutes. So come back. It's going to be part 3, and I'm going to finish breaking the rest of everything down. So I hope y'all follow me. Yo, cuz, follow me. Tell me if you want to come on, man. I can punch you in.